decided that he was going to go out and hold out. So I think the Steelers should just be all in on James Conner and say, hey, Le'Veon, thanks for your time here. We're not going to offer you that third franchise tag next year. You're out of here, bud.
Rick, let's talk about a team that lost a player on Sunday that they are not happy about at all, and that's the LA Rams. Cooper Kupp. Remember him earlier this year in Denver. He dodged a serious knee injury on a very ugly horse collar tackle. He was able to come back. He was not so fortunate on Sunday. He is now out for the season with a torn ACL. Eric Cooper Kupp has become Jared Goff's favorite target. He is definitely a key cog in that Rams offense. So after the loss to Kupp and that news broke, did it change your opinion on the Rams' Super Bowl chances?
Unfortunately, it did a little bit. Again, I said this about the Steelers. I'll say it about the Rams. I'm not a Rams fan, but boy, have they been exciting to watch. But what Cooper Kupp adds to their offense, even as far as stretching the field, because you can get Cooks and Woods downfield while Kupp is a threat in the middle. You lose that. It allows that defense, it allows that secondary to sort of either double up or cheat on the outside a bit more. We'll see in the weeks ahead, does that change their offense at all? I think it actually does. And so when you're talking about them and the Saints being the powerhouses in that NFC, I think you got to give the edge to the Saints now.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for the Rams, as good as they're playing and the matchups that we want to see even this coming week in the game versus Kansas City that I think it's in LA. I don't know what's going on with the NFL at this point, Eric, but I think the loss of Kupp really affects this team because if you take a quarterback's favorite target off of any team, it's going to have an impact on them. And we already saw this team not quite as explosive once Kupp was off the field, even for those few games. You look at a guy like Brandon Cooks. Yes, he's explosive, but he can disappear in games. Robert Woods is probably their most consistent wide receiver that's left. Can Josh Reynolds step up? But I think the Kupp injury, what they were able to do to him, the way they were able to get him matchups in the slot, you think about the fact of getting him matched up against someone like Eli Apple for the Saints, where he torched him for a 41-yard touchdown in that game a few weeks ago. Kupp was a problem and a matchup problems for opposing teams that now the Rams are going to have to scheme in different ways. But yeah, I think it definitely affects this football team. Again, if you take any team out there, you take Julian Edelman off the Patriots, it's going to have an impact. So you start to look at that injury, and then even the Saints, they go out and they add Brandon Marshall to this team. And is Brandon Marshall a huge difference maker between the 20s? No, but in the red zone, I think you could see him have some success. It just gives the Saints another weapon with a team that they're fighting with loses a major weapon. Eric, I kind of touched on it there that the game in Mexico City now has been moved to L.A. due to field conditions, the fact that it was such a poor playing condition. A lot of the players had come out and said that maybe they weren't even going to play in this football game. The field was in such poor conditions. We see it in London as well when those games are there. It looks like Soldier Field and someone just didn't mow it for 5 weeks and just set a sprinkler up before the game. It always seems wet and sloppy and thick grass going on in these fields, and you always kind of worry about those playing conditions for the players and injuries that can happen. I know the NFL is trying to push these international games, but Eric, if they can't get the fields right, should the NFL keep trying to push this product on us?
What scares me is that the reason the NFL is doing this is because they want to grow viewership and grow dollars in other markets. The whole thing about Mexico City is kind of bizarre and it's kind of a mess, and it's just kind of an embarrassment at this point. The fact that they were going to have a game there, and I don't know what they're really trying to do as far as growing the market in Mexico. I don't know the business plan there, but it's an embarrassment. Now they've got to move the game to LA, as the Rams were going to be the home team for that. What actually scares me more is the stuff that's going on in London, because I feel like the NFL is trying to sell the idea of having a franchise or two in London in the future. And I think that's just kind of weird. I think that's kind of dumb, because think about the games that we talk about where the East Coast has to travel to the West Coast or vice versa, and the impact that has, whether it's a 1 o'clock game or a 4 o'clock game or whatever. Now you add in traveling across the pond. We already see teams go over there a couple times a year, so it happens. But what if one of those teams is like, that's their home stadium in London, and they're playing 8 games a year over there? The other 8 games, they've got to travel across the pond. I mean, what a huge disadvantage for 1 or 2 franchises, in my opinion, just because their travel schedule would be so vastly different than the other teams. So bringing it back to your question, what scares me is that the reason they do these things and play on compromising fields is to test the waters for making more money, as if the billions of dollars they're making in these 48 contiguous states isn't enough. That's ridiculous. You got to have a product that's consistent and good. And when you see those games in London and when you see it just doesn't make any sense to me, and it's just not necessary.
Eric, the NFL is a $14 billion industry in terms of revenue. They could easily spend a few $1 million to get a nice field turf type of surface down on these fields and not have to worry about this. They don't go to that many different stadiums where they could make that kind of investment and just roll it up after and let them put down the natural grass if they had to on these fields for soccer or whatever else they had going on. You would think that the NFL wouldn't want to continue to embarrass themselves with this kind of product. So, Eric, I'll get you out of here on segment one on one last question. When we talk about embarrassment, that takes us to what happened in MetLife on Sunday as your Jets lost 41-10 to the New England. Wait, no, to the LA Rams. No, to the Buffalo Bills. Eric, they came in to MetLife and whipped put it on the Jets. And somehow, as we record here on Wednesday, even later than we normally do, Todd Bowles is still the head coach of the Jets. So do you agree with this move? Should Todd Bowles still be the head coach? Or did the Jets need to make a coaching change here going into their bye week?
Oh, my goodness. I've written letters. I've made phone calls. I've hired planes to do skywriting over MetLife. I just...
Were you the guy that blamed the poor Jets play on your DWI? That wasn't you, was it?
No, that wasn't me, but I'm getting ready to hire some protesting Democratic streakers to go out there with spray paint on their chest that says, "Fire Todd Bowles" right now.
Uh-oh.
Sponsored by Talkback, of course. No, but I mean, this is ridiculous. This team is a total dumpster fire. I mean, the epitome of the word dumpster fire. You could put GIFs and memes and everything and they would all be appropriate. The fact that they refused to fire Todd Bowles in the middle of the season and say, well, let's just wait till the end of the year is stupid. He needs to go now. There's no point in having him there for the rest of the season. And when you have a high drafted quarterback like a Sam Darnold who needs development, do not waste the next few months of the season and then all of the offseason in a coach search. Do it now. There's just nothing left there for Todd Bowles. He is defensive minded. They suck at that. His offense is terrible. They suck at that. Just get rid of him. I mean, it makes no sense to me, Justin. So no, I'm very upset. I think the Jets have a future if they can just right the ship. You got to rebuild from Sam Darnold on. You've got to figure out receiving core. You've got to figure out your running back situation. The defense is okay, but not great. There's just so many holes in this team. Todd Bowles is not the answer. We know he's not the answer. We know he's getting fired at the end of the year. Do it now and move on.
I don't really have much more to add there. I kind of agree. When you get embarrassed by a 2-win team starting Matt Barkley, yeah, that Matt Barkley, he's still hanging around. What is he now, the 4th or 5th string quarterback on the Buffalo Bills, and they put up 41 points on you? That's an embarrassment. That shows your team is not listening to you. They've tuned you out. Jets, it's time to make a change. Well, that'll do it for segment one. When we come back in segment two, we'll talk about the big NBA trade that went down this past week. Does Jimmy Butler make the Sixers the favorite in the East? Is there problems brewing in Golden State? We'll touch on the story that's happening there. Got a few more NBA topics to touch on, and then we'll take it to NASCAR. Eric talked about in the teaser, did the best 4 drivers for a dramatic race on Sunday make it to the championship 4? We'll touch on that when we come back for segment 2. We are back, and it is talk-worthy time. Let's jump into the other big news that's rocking the world of sports right now, and let's take it to Philadelphia. Eric, a story that we actually cut from the show last week was trying to figure out this saga with Jimmy Butler in Minnesota, and we decided that there just wasn't enough information out there to keep beating a dead horse, and it feels like the Timberwolves, they sort of felt the same way. They finally found themselves a trade partner in Philadelphia, and the Sixers acquired all-star Jimmy Butler. So, Eric, this was a Sixers team. They've sort of been floundering around 500. Joel Embiid has been a monster for them this year, but this seems to be a team that's in a little bit of flux that they didn't go out and make a big splash in the free agent market. They lost Bellinelli. They lost Ilyasova, but now they make the move. They add Jimmy Butler to this roster. So does this now make Philadelphia the favorite to win the East?
The favorite? I don't know. But are they a better team if Jimmy Butler plays like the Jimmy Butler in the Chicago days? Yeah, definitely. I think that you have something going with Embiid and Simmons there anyway. We know that. We like that. As Sixers fans, the both of us, we root for that. So you add another piece. It's hard to say that adding another piece to an already growing roster of stars isn't a good thing. The key is, does he fit in there? Can the three of them play well together? I like the fact that Jimmy Butler can find his own shots and doesn't have to rely on Simmons to create his shots. So I think that helps the Sixers right there. Simmons can dish to Embiid or to Butler as well. Simmons can run the point and let Butler be the small forward guard type position that he can play. I like this move for them. The last piece remaining to me now is the whole Fultz thing. We're not going to get into that right now, but I think this team is really starting to come together nicely. So, for me, if it's the Jimmy Butler of the Chicago days, yeah, Justin, I think this moves them up a peg or two as a contender. To me, you still have the Raptors, which I know is a total flip-flop from what I said in the previews, but they're for real. They're playing like they're for real. You've got the Bucks, which we're still waiting to see if they're for real, but certainly the Raptors, the Bucks, we know the Celtics are not dead and gone. Their record is below what their capabilities are. And then you've got the Sixers. Where do those four teams fit in? But Justin, this solidifies the Sixers as definitely a top 3 or 4 team in the East. And it also solidifies the fact that the East has 4 powerhouses and then the rest.
For sure. I think Philly was clinging to that 4th spot early in this year, the way they were playing. They just weren't playing consistent basketball at all. They were all about Embiid. And we've already seen in the past that he doesn't have the greatest track record of staying healthy throughout the year. So I think adding another weapon that if he has to take some games where he rests or he's out for some, that it's not just going to be all Simmons, that they can turn it over to Butler and Simmons. Markelle Fultz is an unmitigated disaster. I don't know what he's doing at the free throw line. Is he trying to pump fake guys to get a lane violation at this point? I have no clue what he's doing. He looks like Chuck Knobloch at the free throw line at this point, trying to chuck it to first base. That is a disaster that they just can't even depend on him. So I think going out to get Butler, I hated them giving up Saric. I thought he was a nice piece around this team, but Butler is a veteran guy. And Eric, I actually think he's going to fit into this locker room fine, because I think that Simmons and Embiid are driven to get further in the playoffs. They got a taste of it last year. I think now they want to get to an NBA final. And I think what happened in Chicago with Butler before he left, and even in Minnesota, was you had a bunch of young guys that didn't know how to play the game the right way every single night. They didn't bring it every day. And that frustrated Jimmy Butler as a guy who I do think when you watch him play and he's engaged, he plays the game hard. And I think that if he sees Embiid and Simmons doing those things and wanting to drive this team to an Eastern Conference championship and then to the NBA Finals, I don't think there's going to be all that locker room stuff that happened in Chicago and Minnesota. I think what you saw in Minnesota was a player that was frustrated that 2 young guys that didn't bring it every night got max deals, and that pissed him off. I think that if there's any problems, it's basically that these guys aren't sold on winning. If they are, which it seems like they are based on what happened last year versus that Celtics team where a wounded Celtics team basically took it to Philly, I think that Philly with Embiid and Simmons should be very hungry to get back there, and I think Butler will fit in just fine. The Celtics are still trying to find their footing. I think that they're still the favorite to win the East. Toronto's playing very well right now, but I think with having those weapons, adding Butler in, taking a little bit off Embiid, I still don't think there's anybody in Toronto that can stop Embiid. So I think it definitely moves Philly. I think it jumps them past the Bucks and it puts them on equal footing with Toronto, getting Butler in there. And they cleared out a guy in Covington that was basically, he was just ineffective for them in the playoffs last year, Eric. His defense wasn't that great. His three-point shooting was terrible. Jared Bayless had a pretty sizable deal for what he was doing on there. We talked about that in early last year, that Bayless could be a guy that could be expendable for this team, as was Covington. So I was actually happy to see Philly move those guys. Hate to see him lose Saric off of that team, but what do you think? Do you think Jimmy Butler will be able to fit into this locker room, or are you sort of worried about the antics that happened in Minnesota that could come up again here in Philly.
No, I like your analysis. I think you're pretty spot on with that. I think what you saw in Chicago was a guy that, Jimmy Butler bet on himself and he won. He put himself out there. I'm going to play 1 year and show you what I can do. And then he got a nice deal. And he really was that 22 point, 6 rebound, 5 assist type of player. And that in the NBA, that's a top 15 type player, especially at a shooting guard, small forward type position that Jimmy Butler is. He's very valuable. When he went to the Timberwolves,